So, first of all, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I am Joel Chasnoff. I grew up in Chicago, live in Israel now. I did make Aliyah twice after growing up in the Midwest, going to Jewish day schools and summer camps. I just did feel that calling. So I moved to Israel at the age of 23 and joined the Israeli army, serving in a platoon of 18-year-olds who had graduated high school just 3 weeks before. Israel is a land of contradictions, and that is one of them. That literally weeks after high school graduation, you are given the responsibility of defending your country. But it's also one of the things that makes Israel, I believe, very special. Then came back after the army, lived in the U.S. in New Rochelle on 105 Rogers Drive, across from the Davis School for 5 years. Then in 2015, we pulled our 4 kids out of school and backpacked around the world for 1 year. And finally, because we had nowhere else to go, we decided to move back to Israel. And at this point, my twins are 22, just got out of the IDF, and they've already gotten phone calls saying, "You're not needed yet, but be ready." And I do have a 16-year-old who's waiting her draft notice and a 13-year-old. And what I want to do tonight is explore what's known in Hebrew as tohar haneshek, purity of arms. I wanted to take the portion lech lecha and go in a slightly different direction. So there's a story about Abraham we're going to look at tonight that's part of it. But what is purity of arms? Like most Western militaries, Israel has a code of battlefield ethics that dictates how soldiers can and cannot act in battle. And Israel's code of ethics, as it turns out, is different from every other code of ethics in the world in 2 ways. And I'll tell you at the end what those ways are, although there's a chance you might be able to figure it out through our discussion. And what we're going to do in the spirit of summer camp, because I went to summer camp and I loved doing this on Saturday afternoons at my camp, we're going to do a text study. We're going to look at the actual text and some sources that help inform it. So with the help of a few of you, if you could just pass these out. I think I do have one for every person in the room. You might have to double up, but there's 100 of them here, and so this looks, thank you very much, sir. Yeah, give the band also. Just pass them back. Thank you. Oh, let me have one. Yeah. And you can keep these, by the way. One of the great things about this session that I really love is that each one is very different. I want to emphasize this is not me lecturing to you. What I really want to do is make this a conversation. I'm going to ask you to chime in. There are no right or wrong answers. When we're talking about ethics in battle, this is a very complicated topic. When Rabbi Blake and I first thought of making this the topic, we thought it would be really interesting. We didn't realize how relevant it would be. But now, on the eve of what may be a ground invasion, no one knows for sure, I think this topic is more relevant than ever. So while we're just passing them out, feel free to look at it. It's 2-sided. And we're going to start on the side with the gold star in the upper left corner. I want to mention that every soldier in the Israeli army has a session on tohar haneshek, on purity of arms, on ethics in battle. It's not only for the elite combat soldiers or for the fighter pilots. Every soldier has this session, including my 2 daughters who were not combat soldiers. They were involved in combat operations, but they themselves did not carry a gun on their way home from the base. But they went through it too. The IDF believes that every soldier needs to be familiar with these principles. So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to read you the 5 main elements of what's called Ruach Tzahal, the spirit of the IDF, and then I'm going to ask you to question. So number 1, the Israel Defense Forces is the state of Israel's military. The IDF operates under the authorities of the democratic civil government and laws of the country. The purpose of the IDF is to protect the existence of the State of Israel and its independence and to thwart enemy efforts to disrupt its normal way of life. IDF soldiers are obligated to fight, to devote all their strength, and even to sacrifice their lives for the defense of the State of Israel, its citizens, and its residents. IDF soldiers will act according to the values of the IDF and its orders, while maintaining the laws of the state and human dignity, and respecting the values of the State of Israel as a state that is Jewish and democratic. That is the entirety of the main spirit of the IDF, Torah Neshek. Those 5 sentences. So what I want to ask you is, does anything jump out at you as interesting, strange, obvious, not obvious? Just any thoughts come to mind when seeing that the principles of ethics in battle are really based on these 5 sentences? What jumps out at you as being relevant here or surprising? Hand? Where? Jewish and democratic. This was a huge issue this year for the past 9 months. Some are saying this is one of the reasons that the tragedy of October 7th might have been able to happen, because we were so distracted with this question of democratic, Jewish, what does that mean? And I just want to add that I wrote this book that Rabbi Blake mentioned called Israel 201, which came out about half a year ago. And every expert that I interviewed said that the biggest threat to the State of Israel is not Iran or Hezbollah, or believe it or not, even Hamas or Islamic Jihad. It's the internal question we have about, are we a Jewish state or are we a state for Jews? That is not the same thing. And so this idea of Jewish and democratic, that in the spirit of the IDF, it says that we need to follow the rules of law according to the principles of a Jewish and democratic state. Yes, that's very, very relevant. I'm also going to point out, by the way, that it says, in number 4, it says, and even to sacrifice their lives for the defense of the State of Israel, its citizens and its residents. It does not say its Jewish citizens and its Jewish residents. I think that's important. There are 9 million people living in Israel. 7 million are Jewish. 2 million are not Jewish. 22% of Israel's population is, for the most part, Arab, Muslim, Christian, or Jews. And one of the amazing things we have seen in the past 3 weeks, Hamas did call on the 2 million Arabs living inside Israel to join the fight against the Zionists and take arms, and they have not. And I believe they deserve recognition of that. And some politicians have begun to say that. But let's just keep that in mind. Okay, that's a great thing to point out. What else? Other points that people notice from this? I thought I saw another hand over here. Yes, sir. My last point. Yes. And their humanity. They're soldiers, but yes, but I think this, in number 4 and number 5 especially, it leaves a lot of room for soldiers to make decisions for themselves as human beings. And you can argue that this is not a good thing. What happens to your army when you start saying to the soldiers that you need to act according to values while maintaining the laws of the state and human dignity? These are kids who are 18, 19, and 20 years old. Should we really be giving them so much freedom to make decisions in the heat of battle? What do you think about that? Yes, sir.
What's unique about the IDF is that you can't use the excuse, I was just following orders.
So let me just repeat that. So what he said is, what's unique about the IDF is that you can't just make the excuse, I was just following orders. And this is very true. I remember when I was in the Army and we had this session, our officer gave us a scenario that had happened in the West Bank in the 80s during the Intifada, and he said, this is a true story about a platoon of paratroopers who came, they were in a firefight in the West Bank, and suddenly their enemy was surrounded by a ring of women, Arab women, who formed a circle around the terrorists that they were trying to capture, and the paratrooper officer gave the order to fire, killing the women, but in order to capture the terrorists. And the soldiers refused the order. They said it was unethical, and they refused. The commander, the officer, ordered them again and he said, I will court-martial you. You'll be court-martialed and thrown in jail if you don't follow the order. And they did, in fact, follow the order. And they were court-martialed in the end for following the order. They went to jail, and the officer was relieved. They were supposed to disobey this order. So you're very right. This is not an army where you can just say, I was doing what I was told. You can be thrown in jail for doing what you're told if it goes against the ethics of the IDF. Any last points before we move on to the next section? Yes, right here. Yeah, the purpose of the IDF is to protect the existence of the state of Israel and to thwart enemy efforts to disrupt its normal way of life. So just the fact that the country is grappling with the idea that its existence is even on the table. But this is a reality for Israel, and certainly right now when we talk about normal daily life. Let me tell you, as someone who lives there, normal daily life has been completely disrupted for everybody. You know, at the one end of the extreme are the people who've lost family members, or the families of the 224 hostages which are still in Gaza, which is still amazing for me to say that we have 224 of our own in Gaza as we sit here right now. And at the other end of the extreme is every resident of the country whose child is now in school via Zoom because their teachers have been called for reserve military service, or the people who are opening their homes to host guests from the south. 200,000 Israelis have been displaced from their homes, and it's expected now that this will not go back to normal until at least January 1st, possibly longer. So 200,000 people living outside of their homes for another over 2 months. Daily life. We recognize that that's important as well. I want to look at what is actually called the purity of arms clause. The IDF serviceman will use force of arms only for the purpose of subduing the enemy to the necessary extent, and will limit his use of force so as to prevent unnecessary harm to human life and limb, dignity, and property. Any thoughts jump out at you upon reading this, including whether this is even possible? Is this just wishful thinking, or do you think this is even plausible? I'd love to hear that. Yes, sir, back here. You're not answering the question I asked. He asked, how do the settlers fit into the... You know you're in a Jewish group when you ask a question, you're answered with another question. But you know what? These settlers, let's just be honest here, a lot of them do not. They might not adhere to the way that we believe it should be adhered to, but in their mind, they are adhering to it. For them, it is a commandment to defend the land, and that would push them to more extreme behaviors than we're comfortable with. But I agree with that, with your point 100%. Yes, back here. This was put together before 10/7. Yes, it was. Sorry. Yeah. Uh-huh. So what she said was, considering what happened on October 7th, this should be put to the side. Why do you think that? So if I can summarize, what you're saying is that what happened on October 7th is so barbaric, it goes beyond war for territory or resources, so barbaric that the normal rules of war wouldn't apply. Now, I just want to, look, this is a huge debate in Israel right now. If you wonder what Israelis are talking about, one of the things we are talking about is how to respond and how far to go. I have never seen such agreement among Israelis, right, left, center, that Hamas needs to be dealt with, and whatever consequences happen along the way. Usually you see a lot more debating and hand-wringing over what happens to the civilians in Gaza and how much. That is being discussed, but much, much less than before. There is a feeling among Israelis, akin to what you said, that a line has been crossed and we absolutely must dismantle Hamas. And that, if it means thousands of innocent die along the way, and by the way, many are also saying, by the way, they're not so innocent. They're supporting Hamas in other ways. But there does seem to be this agreement that what needs to be done needs to be done. Now, I want to point out something else. According to the rules of law, you cannot attack a civilian institution like a school or a hospital. But if that school or hospital is used by your enemy military as a base, as a place to launch attacks, then you are allowed, according to the rules, not just of Israeli law, but the rules of international warfare. So anyone who claims that Israel, by hitting schools or civilian populations, is not proportional, going against the rules of law, that's simply not true, because Hamas, one of the ways they operate, today there was evidence presented by the IDF spokesman that Hamas's main command center is underneath the largest hospital in Gaza City, with an entrance to it from many tunnels, but also an entrance through one of the wards in the hospital, which means the hospital has to be complicit in allowing this. And that opens it up as a legitimate target. Yes, sir, right here. What rules of war? So, I mean, just to sub... Well, I think, point taken, that when it comes to rules of war, these are very aspirational, but often very not lived up to. Yet when it does come to Israel, I do think we can all agree there's a microscope placed on Israel that isn't placed on other countries. And suddenly the acts that other nations have done over the years not only do not apply, but we are criticized for. I'm going to ask you to flip over the page and look at the top quote. And this is where it relates to Abraham, then Abram. This first quote, this is from Genesis, Bereshit. Vayishma Avram ki nishba achiv vayikra et chanichav yeldei veto 18 veyodov ed dan. And when Abraham heard that his brother was taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318, and pursued as far as Dan. This is a very little-known story. We don't talk about this story a lot from Genesis. But a relative of Abraham was taken captive. And so Abraham gathered up 318 men and went to free this captive. And this very much is the basis of one of the most important concepts in Judaism. In fact, Maimonides, the Rabbi Maimonides, said that the highest mitzvah, the highest commandment in Judaism is pidyon shvuyim, the redemption of the prisoners of war. That Israel should do anything to get back its hostages. And this is another source of debate right now. Do we act as if the hostages don't exist at all? Or do we act keeping the hostages the number one priority? Or something in between? But Judaism has always placed a very high priority on freeing captives of war and hostages. And in the book I wrote, I talked to the former chief psychologist of special forces in the Israeli army about this concept. And I said, doesn't this make the army weak? The fact that our enemy knows that we will do anything to get our hostages back. And one example we can look at is Gilad Shalit. If you look down at the bottom, you see Gilad Shalit, everyone's son. In 2006, Gilad Shalit was kidnapped. He's a tank soldier, was taken to Gaza, and ultimately sat in Gaza for 5 years. And let me tell you, that entire 5 years he was in Gaza, we thought about him. It was like a toothache that you just couldn't shake for the entire day, that no matter what you did, it was still there. And the slogan was, Gilad Shalit haben shel kulanu. Gilad Shalit, everyone's son. That's how we thought of Gilad Shalit. As if it's our own child in there. God forbid, right? I should add. It never left us. And that ultimately is why we gave up more than 1,000 terrorists who had been in prison, almost 600 of whom had committed murder against Israelis in order just to get one Gilad Shalit back. And many in Israel are saying right now that that was a mistake, because we taught the enemy that we will do anything to free just one soldier, and immediately after he was freed, the chant in Gaza, not just among Hamas, but among residents of Gaza, was another 6 Shalits. The idea being that we've learned, if one Shalit releases 1,000, let's kidnap 6 more and release even more prisoners, or get more. So this is a huge debate. Should we do anything to get our prisoners of war back? But this chief psychologist I spoke to said, not only does our enemy know that we'll do anything to get them back, but our own soldiers know it as well. And this is why it's not our biggest weakness, but it's our biggest secret weapon. Because our soldiers can go off to battle knowing that we will do everything to bring them home. I want to look in the middle. If you look to the left, in the middle, there's a picture of a tank, and there's a quote next to it. In 1982, June of 1982, the IDF went into Lebanon because they were being attacked by the PLO for years, cross-border attacks. And many people forget this, that we went into Lebanon in 82, and we actually were successful. We were able to win that. We achieved what we had hoped to achieve quickly. However, we stayed in Lebanon for 18 months. That's the Middle East. As one of my commanders in the army said, you go to the dance with one girl and go home with another. The idea being that you go to Lebanon to fight the PLO, we ended up staying 18 years to fight Hezbollah. And that's a very big concern right now. That if we win this war against Hamas, well, what happens the day after that victory? Who fills that vacuum? We have to make sure we have a plan there. Because Hezbollah took power after the PLO was ousted. But in June of 1982, there was a colonel in the armored brigade named Eli Geva. He was, at the time, the youngest brigade commander in the entire IDF. And he was given the order to lead his entire platoon into Beirut and to take over Beirut. And he uttered what many in Israel consider some of the most famous words ever spoken by an Israeli soldier. He said, Mistakel b'mishkefet vero'eh yeladim. I look through my binoculars and I see children. And he refused to lead his soldiers into Beirut for that reason, because he could see children through his binoculars and he knew that they would end up being casualties. And he was called back to Israel and he met with the prime minister, and the prime minister relieved him of his post. He was given a dishonorable discharge. But even now, Eli Geva, his name evokes what Israelis call good chutzpah. You know, in America, we say chutzpah. We often see it's a bad thing to have the chutzpah, the gall. But in Israel, there's 2 types of chutzpah. There's the bad chutzpah and there's the good chutzpah. The good chutzpah is speaking up to authority, challenging who's in power and speaking your mind. And Eli Geva is seen as an example of the good chutzpah. And many still take inspiration from him. During this past 9 months, the ordeal we had with the government, there were many reserve soldiers in the Air Force especially who said, I refuse to do my training missions if I don't see us serving a democratic state, like we read in point number 3. This has to be a democratic Jewish state. And that, a lot was taken from inspiration of Eli Geva's deed in 82. Yes, sir. Hang on 1 second. Rabbi Blake, how much time do I have? 5 minutes? Okay. Yes, sir. I told you 2 stories. So right, Eli Geva was relieved of his command, and the soldiers were thrown into jail for not. Yes. I realize that those stories are completely contradictory, and I think maybe that's the point. I mean, this is so messy, and it's so case by case. This is what Israel finds itself in. I wish I had a great answer for you for why. I don't. Mm-hmm. It is, the word you used was subjective, and yes, it is. There's a lot of subjectivity here. When I was in the army myself, I was amazed at how much soldiers talked back to their commanders and questioned their officers, which is a very Israeli thing, just to talk back. And I should add, it's an army where you're on a first-name basis with your commanders and your officers after basic training. All of Israel is like that. It's a very informal country. One of the founding principles of Israel is that we're not going to follow the manners that other countries, it's the old Jew had. We're going to be the new Jew who is powerful and who speaks to authority, social levelers. And so kids call their teachers by their first name, their principal by their first name, and soldiers call their officers by their first name. And another thing you can do in the Israeli army is argue with your officers. And I was amazed. How do you run an army when you're arguing? But I believe it makes for a better army because everyone feels like he or she can be heard. And there's dialogue there. But yes, it is subjective. You have a question or a point? No. You said what? It's amazing they have these 2 documents. Okay, so you bring us kind of to the end where we talk about what are these 2 things that are unique about the IDF's Code of Battlefield Ethics. Well, one is that in all the other Code of Battlefield Ethics in other countries, the main focus is on you. If you get captured as a POW, what are you obligated to not reveal to the enemy? And what secrets are you allowed to divulge? It's all about protecting your army's secrets. The IDF is the only one with so much emphasis on how to treat the enemy humanely, whether it's only using your weapon for force to subdue the enemy, or making sure you maintain dignity of life and property. The IDF's the only one. The other point is that the IDF is the only one that puts so much emphasis on rescuing the prisoner of war and reassuring our own soldiers that if they are captured, we will do everything to bring them back home, which sadly is such a relevant point right now. The fact that we have 224 of our own in Gaza as we speak, including the elderly, women, and 30 children, is really simply unthinkable. It's a reality that Israelis are still failing to fully grasp, and it's what really makes this different. Other times when we've had awful incidents, there was a sense of closure once it was over, and now we move on. But this is going on every day that they sit there, and that is another aspect of what makes this so painfully different for the average Israeli right now. I wish we could go into every point on this sheet and discuss it in further detail. I will be sticking around after services a little bit if you want to chat one-on-one, and you can take these home with you and look at it further. But I want to thank you for participating, and tomorrow morning I'll be back as well. I'll be talking more in depth about the book I wrote and answering questions about the situation right now. So please come to services and stick around for my talk right afterwards. I think it'll be really a good chance to get into the heads of, not just the stories you're seeing online and in the news, but what is the average Israeli thinking, saying, and how are we coping during this difficult time? Toda rabah. Shabbat shalom.